of course, than humans have and longer than plants. So they're not going anywhere. Fairy ring's been here a long time. But you're right.
Yeah, absolutely. You've done so much to create awareness about fairy ring. Frisky Fairy Ring Friday is that's a good one. And this is one of those diseases that I think everybody, that likes this kind of Root Docs miniseries is going to listen to. And it can be very challenging to manage. I mean, this, not to say controlling dollar spot is easy,
right? But
this is a different beast. And, as you said, over 60 different organisms can cause this. Right. With that, all those organisms could have different sensitivities to temperature, different sensitivities to what fungicides we use. Correct. And I'm sure that plays into why this is so difficult.
Right. You mentioned the hashtag Frisky Fairy Ring Friday, which happens on Twitter. And I have to give credit also to Dr. Derek Settle and Dr. Henry Wetzel. The three of us kind of came up with this together years ago. I think one of the first tweets is about that. And it's been kind of fun to post fairy ring pictures every Friday from all over the world. And some of them are just really fun to look at, the mushrooms and things. But there's also a serious point of view from those posts on damaged turf and then conversations that take place after that, or folks sharing what they're doing to manage fairy ring. So it's been a lot of fun. It's been educational. Hopefully I think it's been very helpful as well. But you mentioned the Basidiomycete species, and you're spot on. I've seen fairy ring symptoms in the winter months, the cold tolerant fungal species, Basidiomycete species. In the spring, there's certain species. In the summer, there's certain agaricus and other species, marasmius, that really like hot, humid weather. And then there's other Basidiomycetes that'll thrive in the cooler temperatures. And we don't know, unfortunately, if you take 50 to 60 of those species, maybe there's 10 to 12 most common, but we really don't have sensitivities to all of them. We assume because they're all Basidiomycetes that they're kind of sort of probably all susceptible to the same groups and classes of fungicides, but we don't know for sure. And that may cause some issues. Let me just take a step back with fungicides. And Jesse, as you know, there's many fungicides now available for managing fairy ring. Where going back to the 90s, there was only one that was developed for it specifically. That was the active ingredient flutalonil, and it was the name ProStar, as you're aware. That was your legacy company's active ingredient, ProStar WP wettable powder. Then it became a WG. So the flutalonil active ingredient was very effective at managing fairy ring. And then since then, there's many other fungicides have been labeled for fairy ring. But you're right, the environmental conditions, the soil, the root zone, sandy soil, thatch, organic matter, there's so many factors that play a role in managing fairy ring. And these environmental factors and edaphic soil root zone factors, they're all going to play a role in the success or failure of a fairy ring management program.
And a lot of recommendations for
water.
Say you want to. This is coffee. Yeah. A lot of the recommendations for managing fairy ring, at least from a preventative approach, especially from various manufacturers like ourselves and obviously others included. One of the things I've always wondered is, with the exception of some of the tropical locations, we say right around 50, 55 degree soil temperatures that, these fungi kind of start waking up, so to speak. And to begin that, from a fungicide perspective, begin that preventative control. What I've always wondered is, So it's kind of been established, and I don't really know the data behind it about that 50, 55 degree window. But is there that upwards limit that we can say, okay, at these temperatures, those pathogens are then, or organisms are then going to just kind of go into remission on the warm or hot side of the temperature range?
Oh, good question there. The temperature, the minimum temperature threshold, let's call it, was developed by Dr. Lee Miller. Now he's at Purdue University. He was a grad student at North Carolina State University, and he worked out the preventative application timings in spring applications and corresponded to that the soil range that you're talking about, 50 to 55. He had good results with applications starting then. The kind of as you mentioned, the basidiomycete fungi sort of starting to wake up, so to speak, and move into the spring and then into the summer. So that soil temperature threshold was very helpful to it for making preventative applications. Over the years, though, what we don't know if could we get away with one preventive application? Does it take two or three? And it just depends on the site. In some years with environmental conditions, you could get away with one application. In other years, it may take two or three or four preventive applications. We just don't know. How can you predict the weather and environmental conditions? But your question about upper threshold, that we don't know. I would assume that for many of these basidiomycete fungi, yes, there's an upper limit. But there's some, like Agaricus campestris is one. That one loves not Agaricus campestris. That's a common meadow mushroom that likes it more. There's Agaricus brunescens. That one really likes hot, humid weather. So that threshold may be 100, 105 Fahrenheit or above it. Who knows? Could be even higher. So we don't know the upper limit on these. But it's a good rule of thumb to start your preventative applications in the spring. But again, it depends on your geographic location. Like if you're in Florida, you want to make the preventative applications in, November, December, going into January through May. That's their peak fairy ring season, although they can deal with fairy ring all year round. So it just depends. And then the other part of the soil temperature thing, the environmental sort of component, is the soil moisture and the root zone moisture content. That's so very important for developing these fairy ring symptoms. And then let me. I just paused for a minute and take a sip of water because I was thinking. I don't know if it might be of interest to your audience. Growing up on the mushroom farm, okay, the basidiomycete, the mycelium, we have to get it to colonize the composted substrate, and to do that, we subjected the material, the growth substrate, to a series of irrigation cycles, wet-dry cycles. We would irrigate it, soak the sort of the composted material, and then dry it, and irrigate it and dry it. We have big air handling machines to move air through the production house. These are 60,000 square foot sort of production houses, and so we had to subject the fungal mycelium, the basidiomycete is colonizing the compost, and the mycelium is subjected to these wet-dry cycles that encourages colonization, breakdown of the material, and then if you've ever seen the inside of a commercial mushroom production farm in Pennsylvania, typical in the United States, there's an organic layer on top of the substrate material, very similar to thatch. The mycelium has to colonize that organic layer, and then the mushrooms are produced again because of the wet-dry cycles. So that's the inside scoop on how you grow commercial mushrooms. But let's look at on golf courses. We have wet-dry cycles, don't we? The rain events. Right now, we're dealing with some drought stress and things, but then it's going to rain, so it's going to get dry and wet, dry and wet. We'll get these wet-dry cycles, and guess what? The basidiomycetes colonizing the thatch. They're wood-decaying fungi. They're breaking down, looking for lignin, and under the right environmental conditions, they're going to produce then mushrooms. But all what's happening though in the thatch and root zone, you're getting very hydrophobic or water repellent conditions. So this is where the fairy ring fungi throws this sort of a monkey wrench in a way. As you know, Jesse, the fungus is not colonizing the turf, or it's not infecting the turf like Pythium or Rhizoctonia, whatever. It's trying to engineer the environment. It's making the root zone and thatch very water repellent. It's trying to survive, and in doing so, it's causing a lot of damage to the turf. So you see how the temperature and the soil moisture and the rainfall, it all has to come together for fairing. And some of our golf courses out there and our golf course superintendents are just really good at growing fairy ring. I have to give you a lot of props. And it's not their fault. It's just environmental conditions, lean and soil. And fairy ring loves sand-based soils.
Yeah, it almost makes you think, deep and infrequent irrigation is almost, in a way, encouraging those cycles of wet and then let it go dry and then wet it again. And
that's a good question. In a way, you could say it might be, but I err on the other side that deep and infrequent irrigation favors the growth and development of turf. So you want healthy turf, healthy root zones, that kind of thing. So I would say, well, stick with your deep and infrequent irrigation program. It's the light and infrequent. There's light, irrigation sort of cycles when you're wetting that thatch and drying it, wetting it and drying it. That can really favor, I think, some of the basidiomycetes out there. So we just got to be careful of that. And again, you mentioned the preventative fungicide applications, and that's been a game changer, I think. Unfortunately or unfortunately, it's something you have to sort of commit to. Like, I'll give you a quick example. A few years ago, I did a preventative study on a golf course in central Pennsylvania, and for 4 years in a row, they've had fairy ring on their fairways. And so I said, okay, let's do some preventative applications. So we set up the various fungicides and various combinations and things, and we made applications in, I think it was like April, May, June, July. No fairy ring showed up. It was so frustrating. And anyway, that's the nature of the beast with fairy ring. The issue there at that particular site, the golf course had really severe thatch layer, a lot of organic matter on the fairways, and within those 3 to 4 years, he was engaging in an aggressive thatch reduction program, core aerification, core cultivation, and that kind of thing. I think long term that helped. I wish he would have delayed it maybe 1 year. We could have really got some nice preventative fairy ring data. But that's the nature of the beast with fairy ring. Some of these fungicide trials turn out well, and some of them you scratch your head and say, I made the applications here on this fairway, but on that fairy ring showed up. So,
yeah, that's funny you say that, because right after I finished graduate school, I was at the Chicago District Golf Association, and I'm just young and eager, and I can do anything. And I sent an email out to every cooperator, the end views, everybody. And I found this fairy ring site at this golf course that, using Google Earth, this fairy ring showed up every single year for the last decade plus. And I was so confident. And so I get the money coming in and I'm happy. He's like, yeah, I'm doing all this, put the applications down. Just as you said, nothing. Absolutely. It didn't show up anywhere on that fairway that year. Came back the following year. But, those of you that are doing work on these root diseases, it has to be challenging. It's challenging for everybody. And, what's the joke that if a superintendent wants to get rid of a disease, have a turf pathologist lay down some plots, because then it'll just go away.
Right. That's very true. That's actually a really good saying. That's really accurate. That's true. And that's why with fairy ring sites, I try to go to 2 or 3 or 4 sites when making applications or evaluating treatments in hopes that one or two sites I can actually draw some meaningful data from it. And what I've done over the years is I go after fairy ring, what I call early curative. When I just start to see fairy ring symptoms show up on greens or fairways or tee lawn areas or whatever, then I'll make those early curative applications, as opposed to trying to make actual preventive applications. And I'll let your audience in on a secret, not a secret, but over the years, I've tried to inoculate soil, inoculate turf with fairy ring fungi, to no avail. I have not been successful yet. I'm still trying. And I'm not going to inoculate golf courses on purpose. This is just for research purposes, But I have not been successful at doing that. So that's why early curative is a good way to go, and it helps us to evaluate these fungicide active ingredients. And again, there are many fungicides available now for fairy ring control, and there's data behind them, and they're labeled, of course. But I would always tell folks, read the label, read the label, read the label. The labels change. Look for the rates, timings, information on the label about how to use that fungicide for a fairy ring. One of the best things you can do, in my experience, is when you're using fungicides, don't forget, use them in combination with soil surfactants. That's been a real important component of either preventative or early curative or a curative sort of fairy ring management program.
Would you recommend them together or separate applications? What would be your go-to?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. There's part one and part two. Part one is if you have the time and resources, punch some holes. You have an affected area, early curative, or even if you're going after this preventatively or aggressively curatively, punch some holes. I like needle tining or solid tine. I like to get air into the root zone. Punch some holes, apply a soil surfactant, and water it in thoroughly. Then come back the next day and apply fungicide alone and water that in thoroughly. And then over the next couple of days, every 2 or 3 days, again, water it a couple more irrigation cycles to really thoroughly wet the root thatch and root zone. That's like a best case scenario, the soil surfactant first, then the fungicide. But that's often not the case. Resource challenges and things, and labor and time. So I've had great success with taking a fungicide and a soil surfactant, tank mixing it, good agitation and all that, and then applying it and watering it in very, very. Immediately, you want to. I like to water it in right away. I don't like to make applications and water it in that evening. I've had some success, and that's fine. But I like to water them in right away, and then come back later in the evening and water it again if you can. So best case scenario, soil surfactant first, then the fungicide. But in the real world, you're fine with tank mixing soil surfactants in the fungicide. And the soil surfactant part is very important to overcome hydrophobicity, soil water repellence, helps to maintain the root connectivity. Those fairy ring sites can become really hydrophobic, and some of those species can break down the thatch and really release high levels of ammonium, which are detrimental to roots. So there's a lot of bad things happening in the root zone because of fairy ring. And so the soil surfactants are not fungicides, but they certainly help the environmental part of that disease triangle. And so,
yeah.
And again, one application, as you know, Jesse, may not be enough. That it may knock it back, but the fairy ring may be more resilient than we like to give it credit for, and it may come back, so you have to do a second application. I wish we could do one magical application and get season-long control. We don't have that technology yet. Maybe Enview is working on it for us. I don't know.
Yeah, there's something called calichlor that I'm kind of curious how that would work. And
right, it's funny. You hear the old timers talking. Not too many of them left. Back in the days, they used the mercury-based fungicides and heavy metals and things, and that basically sterilized the soil. Jeez, that was different time.
Yeah,
different.
You know what would be hilarious is I sometimes think this back, like thinking of old chemistries.
Right.
Imagine like EOP programs back in like the 1900s, 1800s.
Right.
You'd have your distributors, instead of like dropping off a jug of tartan or something like that, they'd be like, oh, here's your barrel of arsenic, here's your barrel of lead.
Right.
And if you spend this much, we'll give you a giant mixing spoon. And then I think that would just be funny.
Oh, I know that without any gloves and personal protection. Oh, it was different times. But that's true. Back then, there were heavy metals and the lead arsenates and things in many of these kinds of products. And so it's interesting. I think one of the things, though, with fairing cultural practices wise, we've gotten much better with mitigating the severity, with reducing the severity of fairing, and that managing organic matter has gotten much better. Of course, surfactants are much better at managing, mitigating organic matter accumulation, and there's various schools of thoughts on this with core aerification, core cultivation, sand top dressing, all that. It's all about managing organic matter, and that really helps to reduce the severity of fairing. It won't eliminate it, it won't completely prevent it, but it certainly can reduce the severity of fairing. Just again, by managing organic matter and by managing moisture in the root zone. If you can keep that moisture uniform, avoid the swings of really wet, really dry, volumetric water content in your root zone over the summer. Again, you won't eliminate fairy ring or completely prevent it, but you'll definitely reduce the severity of it. That's one thing I've noticed the last several years. Just you could, using soil surfactants can help you maintain, especially certain ones, can help you maintain nice, uniform, consistent moisture over time, even when it's too wet or too dry conditions. That really kind of keeps the fairy ring fungi sort of in check. Kind of interesting. I wish I had like 3 postdoctoral students working on this. It would keep them busy.
No kidding. There's so many things about that. The soil surfactants are so important. I forget who said it. Like somebody said, like, how do they kind of work? It's like it's drier when you use this surfactant. It can be drier when things are wet and wetter when things are dry, and it kind of just evens things out a little bit better.
Right there, and I'm going to give a shout out to Daniel O'Brien, a grad student, University of Arkansas. He just published an article in the USGA Green section. I think it was last week or earlier this week, talking about soil surfactants. Well, we know them. Technically they're soil surfactants, but yeah, as you know, the industry, we refer to them as wetting agents. And so look at the USGA Green section for that article this week by Daniel O'Brien. And then I've published some papers on soil surfactants over the years. Others have as well. Again, trying to gain more of an understanding and an insight into what they are and what they do, and how to use them properly and more effectively. And one thing I want to always tell superintendents and folks in the turf industry: wetting agents don't make water. Okay, when you make a wetting agent application, you got to water them in. Basically, let's call it placement. They need to get into the thatch, into the root zone. The minute we do that with irrigation or rainfall, they're not going to make water. They can't do that. So just got to keep that in mind. How's well, Jesse? I'm remiss here, and so for your audience, where are you located now?
So yeah, I'm currently located in Greenville, South Carolina.
Okay.
Which is in the upstate, and it's been great. So I went from Penn State University, yes, which I'd love to go back now that I actually have a real job and I have a few bucks to spend. Like it's funny, like in grad school I was in Knoxville, and then undergraduate at Penn State. Everybody's like, "Did you go to this fancy restaurant? Did you do this?" Like, I had no money as a grad student. Like I didn't go there.
No, you can't do that as a graduate student. No. Okay, I didn't realize you were in Greenville. Okay, good. Well, you had great experience. Yeah. Spent some time in Chicagoland, and
Yep. And then I was up in Canada representing Enview from a technical sense, and Fairy Ring from coast to coast, from Prince Edward Island all the way out to Vancouver Island. It is just that one disease that you could bring everybody in the room and start talking about it.
Right there. You talk about Canada. There's a lot of fairy ring up there. There still is. There was a professor, Drew Smith, and he was the University of Saskatchewan, and he did a lot of the early work on fairy ring. And you might have saw, maybe you have the textbook, the Smith, Jackson, and Woolhouse Amenity of Turfgrass Diseases textbook.
It's classic.
Dr. Noel Jackson, my academic grandfather, he trained Peter Denoden, who trained me. But Smith, real quick, as I was getting into fairy ring research years ago, I had a lot of questions, and so I picked up the phone and I called the University of Saskatchewan Plant Mythology department. I talked to someone there who put me into contact with Dr. Smith. He had since retired, but he was still alive then, obviously. And I called him, and we had a great conversation over the phone, about an hour-long conversation. And it was just talking about his work with fairy ring. This goes back to the 1950s, and it was really a cool thing to do. And he died 3 months later. He was up in age, but I was so glad I got to talk to him. To kind of just, he was mentoring me a little bit and guiding me on some areas to study with fairy ring to sort of take it to the next level, so to speak. Anyway, I just wanted to share that with your audience. That was such a cool thing. If you're ever in a situation like that, don't hesitate. Pick up the phone or go visit someone, because you never know. Not to get too dramatic here, but just a month ago, I went to visit a golf course superintendent who was retired, and he was that's dealing with some health issues, and we went to see him. It was on a Sunday morning in the hospital, and then a few days later he had passed away. But you never know when this is going to happen, and you're always I always learn something when I talk to these folks that have been through it all. And I'll just share with your audience, the golf course superintendent, he made a comment, and because he hosted professional golf tournaments, and he has an impressive resume, and I don't want to mention the name, but he said, looking back on his career, he said the best thing he ever has done, what he remembers is trying to help people, trying to help assistant superintendents land jobs, things like that. And notice on his deathbed, so to speak, in the hospital, he didn't talk about the greatest thing he did was manage fairy ring or control POA or I'm glad I aerated those greens that year. You know what I mean? It's agronomically, we deal with this all the time and we love it. But at the end of the day, I guess it's about helping people, and you're doing this right now, Jesse. Hopefully your podcast. I really love your program here. The rooting part, I think, is great, and hopefully you're helping a lot of people doing this. There's so much we don't know about roots and root zones, and there's a lot of research going on about the rhizosphere. So watch this space, as my buddy Dr. Stan Koska likes to say. We're going to be learning a lot more about the rhizosphere in the next decade, especially with these young scientists coming through, doing a lot of the work, which I'm so glad. It gives us time to play more golf and watch the fair. Anyway, I'm off on a tangent about that.
This topic. It's certainly going to continue to get more exciting, and what you've done to help train the next generation of superintendents and how to manage fairy ring, and then all the research that people will continue to do on it. I just like to say thanks for everything you've done for this industry, from not only your fairy ring recommendations, but you've been an excellent mentor in the industry. And absolutely thank you for coming on the Root Docs podcast.
And don't forget, buy my book, Achieving Success.
Oh, yes, there it is. Yeah, I will be reading that book.
Yeah, buy the book, 680 pages. There's information on fairy ring in here. Anyway, just a shameless plug for the textbook.
Yeah, I may buy that textbook and ask for you to sign it.
That's great.
I think that'd be really nice to have.
The folks that have contributed to every chapter are outstanding, and I think it's a really good resource for the industry. And it was an honor to do it. So I'm happy to work with you, Jesse, and please call anytime.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Mike, for joining the show. And you can find this series on the NV website and on YouTube.